Welcome to my second video on how to use Groff for intermediate users. In this video, I'm going to walk you through my macros files, and though I won't explain each and every line of code, maybe I'll try and explain each section of code and what each section does. And of course, these files will be up on GitHub for you guys to look at, and I hope I've commented it enough that people can understand. So the first part of this is defining the PDF link colors. By default, they're a weird purplish color, and I've changed that using this. This is just a normal hex code, and you can change it to whatever you want: green, red, yellow, etc., etc. This macro, I think most users of Groff are familiar with. It's to add bullet points. Then this is the very simple macro I use for code boxes. So what it does is first it adds some spacing and then it sets the font to constant width. That's what the CW is. So after B1 you type in whatever code you want to appear and you close it with the B2. B2 adds some more spacing. It closes the box with the capital B2 and it changes the font back to normal. Pretty trivial stuff. Here we get to the juicy bits of my macros document. A Groff stores information in registers. They can be number registers or string registers. Number registers are defined by NR and string registers are defined by DS. So this beginning part is just defining the registers that I'm going to use in the rest of my macros file. The S register is used for counting equations, F register used for counting figures, and T for counting tables. So the initial value is 0 and it increments by 1. Next, I start defining the strings that I want to use for numbering. And I have to use a string register instead of a number register because Groff stores the heading numbers as a string. So this asterisk SN, this stores the number of your numbered heading. And I can't convert the string back into a number, so hence I've had to make the whole macro as a string. Next is the head macro. Uh, it's pretty simple. It does almost the same thing as the NH macro. This first part handles arguments. The second part checks if the level has reduced. For example, if you've gone from level 2.1 to level 3, that resets the numbering so it starts counting from 1 again. And this part of the head macro, it redefines the sizes. So depending on your level, it changes the font size. So if it's level 1, increments the font size by 3. If it's level 2 by 2, by level 3 by 3, and you can change these to whatever suits you, but I think this is pretty aesthetically pleasing in the final document. And the last thing that this head macro does is it invokes the xn command. Xn, if you know, that's used to generate a table of contents. So this takes the title that you put in and it saves that in your table of contents. The EQ macro is also pretty standard. The only extra thing it does is it automatically increments the numbering. And most of this macro is just handling the arguments. There isn't much to this. The en macro is a little bit more complex. The first section, it handles the arguments. The second section, it places the PDF mark link. So it marks this section of the document with the equation number that you can call later. And the last section, it writes all that information into the equation stream, and that's saved in a separate file. This next macro is the PIC macro. It basically invokes PDF PIC. Most of this is again argument handling depending on how many arguments you pass to it. And then there's naming the figure. So this text, the text that appears right below the figure, adding the PDF mark, and writing information to the stream so that it can be processed at the end. The next macro is the TE macro that's used to end a table. I've added some extra functions to that as well. And it's almost the same as the pick macro. handles some arguments, uh, places some text below the table, puts a PDF mark in that place, and then it writes to the stream. So the reason that I put negative spacing in most of these macros is that you'll notice that these macros, they're used to end an equation or they're used to end a table. So that means whatever mark I put is put right after the equation or right after the table. But I want the mark to point to the table. So what I do is I bring up the lines a little bit. I use negative spacing. I put the mark smack dab in the middle of the table or the equation or the figure, and then I bring the spacing back to normal. This also helps with the preview that you see when you hover your mouse over the PDF link. And at the end again, here we have information being written to the stream. At the very end of this file, so this is where I open the streams to write all the stuff into my equations file, figures files, and the table file. In each of those streams, I've got to give it some information. So things that I wanted to display. And you'll see this is pretty standard Groff stuff. The only notable thing about these streams is that I use the TA macro. So TA, it sets the tab width. So it says that I want my line to start at 0 indentation. And then my tab is going to be 6 inches long, but I want the tab to be right aligned. So this is what aligns all the page numbers to the right side of the page. It's pretty important that this number is the same as your line length over here. Of course, you can change this according to your preferences, but try to ensure that these are the same, or at least that this tab length is not bigger than the line length over here. This part is for the equation stream. The next part is pretty much the same thing for the figure stream, except I changed the name of what's displayed. The same for the table stream. And here are some macros that define registers, and these are used by the closing macros file. The closing macros file is pretty short. I add a break page at the end of every stream, then I close the stream, and then I add in the equation file, the figure file, and the table file, which contain all the information that we've just written back into our document. Remember that this closing macro is being called at the end of our MS template. So it's being called here. It's as good as saying, all that stuff that we just outputted into a file. Now I want to bring all that stuff back into this original file, and I want to process them, and I want to read what's in the file. The rest of these commented lines are just older ideas that I had, which didn't quite work out, which weren't quite as elegant, so I'm not going to get into that. And that's it. So these two macro files are what contain pretty much all of my custom macros, which help me make my document look good and make it functional as well. I'll of course have this in my GitHub so you can take a look at it. I think I've added a comment on most of the things that I've done. You should just note that sometimes DS, it processes this entire line even if you do add a comment. So watch out for errors that may arise when you use DS like this. You should also not add a comment over here. So if there's a code block like this following an if statement or a for loop or something, adding a comment after this, it's not gonna mess with how this functions, but for some reason it adds a space when this macro is processed, and that just adds unnecessary spacing in your document. Next, I want to look at how to do drawings in Groff. Again, this is not bare bones basic stuff. It's a little bit intermediate. Um, and if you do want to get to the basics, I suggest you check out Gavin Freeborn's videos. He did a pretty good tutorial on how to use pick and how to do drawings in Groff. But let me go ahead and show you my file right now. So before I start this, I should tell you that all of the stuff is processed by pick, GNU pick. And I just want to say that GNU pick is probably one of the most difficult pieces of software to search for because any search query returns results that have nothing to do with GNU pick. It had such a generic name, and finding information about it was very, very difficult. But let's get back to this. So first we have this flowchart over here. This flowchart I've written by making a bunch of boxes and joining those boxes with lines. It looks like a lot of code, but it's not that complicated actually. But the problem I see with this is that it's a lot of writing. I think this is almost 30 or 40 lines of code to make this one flowchart. If you're actually trying to get work done and if you think you can get it done faster using some other GUI application, I suggest you do that because if you're completely new to using pick, this takes a little while to make and it's not always practical, I feel. So yeah, this flowchart was written just making a bunch of boxes. I define my main box as mbox. I draw a box with rounded edges with the radius 0.07. This is the text I want to appear in the center of the box. And I've got to include this escape sequence here to specify the color because by default the color of this text is black, but I want it to be white. Oops. Then I can shade the box with a color, and I've defined a custom color called C. This is the hex code for the color up here. I specify the height and the width over here. The great thing about pick is that you can use it almost like a medium or high level programming language where you can define variables like this, where you can put in for loops or if statements that are pretty easy to read and people who have programmed a little bit in C or C++ should be pretty familiar with. Over here, this is the position, and this is just the coordinates of my box. So the rest of this is pretty repetitive. I make a top box. For example, this is my C box. No, sorry, this is my C box. And I draw a box below it, and then I draw a line joining those two boxes. And I continue to do that. So what I've done is I've drawn each column. So first I do the center column, and then the left column, then the right column. Yeah. And then I've drawn lines between all of the boxes. So again, a little bit complex and maybe not worth it to write all this code to draw a flowchart. But what I think is worth it is to draw maybe simple diagrams like this. For example, if you had to draw lattice structures, it's pretty easy. You can define circles using their coordinates like this. You can add the radius of the circle. Then you can just join all the center points of the circle using lines. You can even add dashed lines or dashed circles over here. And we end up with a pretty decent looking diagram, I'd say. The next thing we have is a bending moment diagram. I feel like this is a good use of pick and that people can benefit from making diagrams or drawings like this pretty easily. I believe that LaTeX has an add-on of some sort called TickZ that does the same thing, or it does or makes similar looking diagrams like this. I've never used it, but I think that's like a direct competitor to using pick in Groff. So while this looks like a wall of text, I don't think there's a much better way to do it. I'd say given how complicated this drawing was, I'd say this wasn't that many lines of code to come up with this drawing. It's nothing but drawing lines and boxes, shading those boxes, drawing dotted lines, adding text to those boxes. And though it may look a little intimidating at first to have to write all this, I think once you start going through it and once you've gotten a little familiar with how to use pick, it's not all that bad. Although I will say that I had two issues with making this drawing. The first one is there's no easy way to draw these arrows here. By default, pick recognizes the beginning, the center, and the end of a line, but there's no way for me to easily define this point on the line and this point on the line, and I had to end up using some trigonometry to figure that out. However, I must say that if you are making bending moment diagrams like this, I expect you to know a little bit of trigonometry, and you should probably be all right with doing this stuff. But yeah, you can see that I've defined some angles and the tangent of that angle to try and compute these points. The second problem that I have with using pick to make this diagram is that there's no way for me to put a hatched pattern over here. So hatched patterns are used to signify that there's a fixed wall of some sort over here. And I just haven't been able to find a way to do that in Groff or in pick. I believe that you can do that in TickZ on LaTeX, but here just no luck. I can just shade it. I've tried my hand at it over here, and I've had to use some for loops and try to define it. But this is a very rough or rudimentary way of doing it, and I think this is going through too much effort to make a hatch pattern like this. So if you do know a way to make patterns like this in Pick or in Graph, please let me know, because I think that will be pretty useful for me and a lot of people who are studying engineering. And at the end, we have some chemical diagrams or diagrams of molecular bonds and molecules. I'm not an expert on this stuff either, so I've just added in some examples from the man page. However, this doesn't compile with pick, so you can't get away with just using the P option when you compile your graph document. You've got to use the J option. So if I pull up the man page of Groff, it says that J is used as a preprocessor for chem, and that implies P. So I think if you're using J, you don't have to use P. So that's about it for this video. I hope this has been helpful for people who are looking to take their next step in Graph and use that for churning out good looking reports. If you have feedback or suggestions, you can put them in the comments or maybe send me an email about them. And I would definitely love to know if there are any alternatives to some of the things I couldn't do in this video. For example, the hatched patterns in Pick. And I also want to know if anyone has fancy thesis templates for MS macros, because while my MS template produces a decent enough looking report, I don't think it's good enough to make a proper scientific thesis. The other thing I want to know is if I'm better off using MOM or Neotrof to do whatever I've done here, because maybe there's an easier way to do all the stuff that I've done uh, in this video. If you want to know more about Groff, you should also check out this book called Unix Text Processing. It was released in 1987, but it contains a lot of useful information about Linux and VI and Groff and equations, how to use EQN and table. This really helped me out when I was doing some of the stuff I had to for this video. And if you really know where to look, you can probably pick up this book for free somewhere up on the internet. A huge thanks to Luke Smith, Gavin Freeborn, and the Groff subreddit for getting people into Groff, including myself. This is where I started. And if you need to get started with Groff, these are some of the best places to look. All the files that I've shown in these videos, they're going to be up on my GitHub. You can check them out over there. And just know that all my macros and everything that I use, they're always a continual work in progress. I'm always tweaking them and trying to make them better. In fact, I made a couple of changes to my macros while I was recording this video. So thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you learned something new about Graph today.